I wanted to connect with somebody who had intimate experience around the band called the Grateful Dead, which is now celebrating its 50th anniversary concert in Chicago. Connected with Bill Cutler via Facebook, and he joins me right now. Bill, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Hi there, Jake. Good to be here.
It's great to have you on, man. Can I ask you a question? I mean, as I've done a lot of, I think you moved to the Bay Area in '67. Is that right?
That was my first time out here. I came out here 2 or 3 times, and I made the final move in 1970. But I was here for part of '67 and part of '68. Yeah.
Okay, so, I have Greg Elmore, the drummer from Quicksilver, on in an hour, but I wanted to ask you, was Cipollina the first cat that was playing lead electric guitar in the Bay Area?
Well, along with, I would say, Jerry Miller from Moby Grape, they pretty much arrived at the same moment. Yorma right after them, but Yorma started as an acoustic guitar player, and Yorma Calkin, and became an electric guitar player with the airplane as the airplane went electric. So I would say that, you could argue it was either Jerry Miller with Moby Grape or it was John Cipollina. They're right at the same moment, I think, I
mean, and even in the history of electric rock music, where do they stand as far as in the history of being the first, not just in the Bay Area, but the first cats? I mean, was it Chuck Berry, or this is out of my comfort zone?
Okay, well, Chuck Berry was certainly the earliest guy to get noticed as a star playing electric guitar and rock. But if you want to go even further back than that, by a few years, you might think about people like James Burton, who was playing electric guitar for Elvis and Ricky Nelson as the lead guitar player in their bands. You know what I'm saying? So in a certain sense, Chuck Berry was the first person who was a lead singer and an electric guitar star at the same time, because Elvis was more or less using the guitar as a prop,
Yeah,
Not
absolutely.
necessarily, and to some degree, and Ricky Nelson, of course, was a guitar player, but he wasn't a lead guitar player.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
that's beautiful. No, and how would you describe? I'll be honest. I mean, I'm just beginning to get my feet into the Quicksilver Messenger service. Cipollina versus Jerry Miller's playing. How would you differentiate between the two of them?
Well, Cipollina was completely a stylist. I mean, he could play 4 notes on the guitar, and you would immediately know that it was Cipollina in the way that you would immediately know Jerry Garcia or Pete Townshend or anybody that's so unique in the way that they play, Whereas Jerry Miller came from a blues-based background and was capable of doing many different things. This is apples and oranges. I'm not putting one above the other in terms of ability.
Sure.
I'm just saying Jerry Miller was a more versatile player. And because everybody in Moby Grape was a lead singer, he would have to adapt his style of playing to whatever the song required, whereas Quicksilver had a sound that was more constant, Jerry himself was a lead singer, so was Skip Spence, so was everybody in the band, and all of them wrote songs. So it was a little bit of a different approach,
How do you account for everyone talks about cycles in music, that things are inevitably cyclical and history repeats itself, and I'm a believer in that. But and then we didn't even get into Yorma yet, who I know you've collaborated with. But I mean, you have so many guys, all these distinctive sounds. Is it fair to say it would be almost impossible to say that would ever happen again, just because of the era of immediacy and interconnection and electronic music now? I just say that everybody was an individual. Nobody even knew it. Nobody even knew each other, and it was so vibrant. And everybody was their own person, and and their own player. And I wonder. Yeah. I'm not trying to say that there aren't unique cats out there now, but I just don't think we'll ever see a time like that. I just want to reflect on that and get your perspective. And I know you were right in it, making music at that time as well.
Well, I don't think we will see a time like that again for several reasons. One is that, there were such tremendous disruptions in society right at the time that, say, I was a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
in the mid '60s and stuff, that the upheaval in society became reflected in the art that got produced. And today, you don't have everybody concentrating on, 13 television stations and 5 big radio markets and things that bring people together. You have everyone in their own individual niche, right? At that particular time, the things that were happening in the world were so dramatic and so broad that the people reacting to them sought each other out. I mean, they started as the rebels against what was going on. So all the stuff you're talking about came about partly because people regurgitated how they felt. It wasn't a marketing device. It was each individual guy had his thing. So I wouldn't say that people didn't know each other. I mean, when I was growing up in Manhattan, there was a music scene. And if you were in Greenwich Village and you were playing the circuit, I mean, you knew John Sebastian, and you knew Eric Anderson, and you knew Buffy St. Marie, and you knew Tom Rush and Phil Oakes and maybe Bob Dylan,
Mm-hmm.
because everybody was in a certain circle. They didn't do the same thing. They were all individuals, but they all lived off the same 5 or 6 clubs and the same 5 or 6 record labels that were interested. Then when I got to San Francisco, let's say '67, I mean, Quicksilver were very tight with the Grateful Dead and Big Brother and 6 or 7 other bands, Moby Grape and all the other bands that were forming at the time. And they were in a scene together, but they were all doing their individual things. And they also had time to develop. There was career development.
Sure.
I mean, there really isn't any time now. You either make it huge on your first record and nobody cares.
Well, no, I just there's a couple of things. You talked about the niche, and the business, and the marketing now, where it's like, okay, well, this thing's been poll tested, and we know we can sell 1 million copies of this. So even if it's terrible music, we can just get it out there. Where you look at Garcia, Yorma, David Crosby, Michael Bloomfield.
Right.
These guys were so predicated on making music that felt good, and was up to their standards. And I also would say that it's not like we're living through a boring time right now. I mean, there's a lot going on everywhere, but I would argue that there's been. I've seen some articles recently about younger cats that were sleeping through a revolution right now. Just because we're before there was no air conditioning, there were no flat screen TVs, there was no. You went out and the music was there, the venues were there, so of course you connected with the people, and from those unique scenes, that's where this populist, individualistic music grew. Where now
exactly.
So I'm just tell me about whether you agree with the sleeping through the revolution. I mean, I use new media as a tool. But there's a lot of cats, that, they're playing games all day. It's because I just feel like there's still a storm raging out there.
Right. I agree with you that the sleeping through a revolution is an interesting way of putting it. What happened was, you used to have to go out to do it. I mean, if you wanted to make it in music, it was absolutely necessary to tour. It was absolutely necessary to put in, as Malcolm Gladwell would say, the 10,000 hours on your instrument. Or if you were a songwriter, the 10,000 hours as a songwriter. Now we have this kind of thing where artists are more interested in the marketing of themselves than what they really have to offer. And as a result, people become big stars in the internet realm, but they're not necessarily developed as artists. They don't have that second, third, fourth album in them. They don't have a grounding in a certain kind of music that they passionately believe in and can't live without, And when we were growing up, that's how it was, your whole world revolved around the record store and the club. That's where I made most of my friends. and some of them are people I still know.
Sure.
But now you don't go to the record store. Now, you go over to Spotify and you stream somebody's music, and you don't get any of the information that you used to get. Who produced the record? Who wrote the song? What do the guys look like? What are they about? Where do they come from? Where did they grow up? I mean, all of that was a big factor to us in the 60s and 70s, and it really has very little to do with it. We're sort of now in a world where singles dominate the market rather than albums. The album had an arc to it. It was an emotional arc. If you listen to a great album, it had a great love song and a great rocker and a social comment tune and a ballad and now you just get these disconnected singles that catch on for some reason or other, but they don't have a cultural resonance with the people listening to them. So that's the difference to me. And I do think there's a lot of people who just expect everything to be brought to them. They don't want to make the effort to go out and find it. And you still have to do that, because the best stuff is not just going to fly into your house.
No, it's certainly not going to be, and it's not going to be marketed in a pop fashion either. Which, I mean, I do spend time in the record stores, but I agree. I mean, it's not. There's a resurgence, but even it's humbling too. I was talking to a record store owner in Boston, and I can see the prices online too, and it's like, these pop. These rock albums. It's incredible. Like, I don't know, you take Metallica or I don't know, maybe Allman Brothers, which is great. Even to a degree, even some of the early Dead albums. Those albums are being reissued on vinyl. People are paying $30-$40 for them. It's like, this is it's fascinating. I mean, again, because my pocket is more, you listen to Greg Elmore drumming or Billy Kreutzmann's drumming or, Spencer Dryden's drumming. I mean, that was a mixture, and Greg Rico and Michael Shreve.
Right.
Those cats were playing, I mean, like Garibaldi told me, it was like, if somebody came up to them and said, hey, boy, that was great. You sounded like, it was time to slit the wrists. Whereas to me, it's like that if that 4/4 rock is just still the only thing going on, we haven't really evolved yet, and that has a lot to do with the electronic drum machine and things like that. But talking to Bill Cutler here,
Sure.
Incredibly glib and a beautiful cat. Do you account for this shift in the music industry from the late 60s through the early 70s, especially into the late 70s? You started to see a real disintegration in the health. I know that these guys smoked cigarettes and they did a lot of drugs, but Bloomfield, Cipollina, Garcia, do you feel that there was a component to I understand the gravity of being the leaders of bands, but how depressing do you think it was for them to see the music industry shift from, corporate, heads that were like, well, we're just going to we're going to leave these guys out, let these guys do their music because we're making money, to actually, no, we don't know anything about this, but we're going to put our hands on it. And then all of a sudden the music made this turn. Do you feel like there was, because those guys really all kind of disintegrated around the same time, a little bit. I mean, some of them will live, but.
Yeah, that's true. I think that, Jerry was the one who I was closest with of all the people you're mentioning in terms of his personal life and knowing him from meeting him in 1968 till the end of his life, And I would say that in Jerry's case, the burden of being the leader of the Grateful Dead, when he really expected to be a lead guitar player, but people put all these other characteristics on him that they expected him to live up to. They saw him as a guru and everything. And he was a brilliant guy and a great friend and the most generous musician I've ever played with in my whole life in terms of just sharing the moment with everybody that he played with. But at some point, the Grateful Dead became a tremendous burden to him. And I would say it was sometime in the later 70s, I look at the Grateful Dead in different periods. To me, there's the early Grateful Dead, with Pigpen and everything. There's the second iteration of the Grateful Dead with Keith and Donna, let's say 1969, 70 to 1978, 79, Then there's the Brent era, and then et cetera. But for me, one of the big demarcation zones was before and after Egypt. The famous Egyptian trip
1978.
that
Sure,
they took
sure,
to
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Egypt. Well, I think that after Egypt, Jerry had a big. I don't want to say he was depressed. I just think that the burden of the whole thing got to be too much. And one of the things he used to say to me when we would play together was that he liked playing with me because he wasn't responsible for writing the material and making all the decisions. And I think it was just a lot of burden on him. If you look at what he did when he was off the road with the Dead, playing with his own Jerry Garcia band, that was mostly cover tunes. That was joyful. It was relaxed. It was a little bit more serious when he played with me because it was original material that he had to learn that wasn't like songs he knew from his past,
Mm-hmm.
But it was still fitting into to someone's band and not having the entire burden put on you, to take all these people on the road. If you stop touring, 56 people are off salary or everybody's waiting around for you. I think that pressure got to him. I think it was a tragic that it did, and I think that I wish more people had intervened in his life, but we all know what happened. And I think there's probably some of that was true for the other guys too, but I wasn't as close to them, so I can't say for sure.
Well, I was going to ask you. I mean, in your own experiences, again, sometimes I listen to shows. My favorite period of time is the early '80s. I have a variety of reasons for that. I just really enjoy the infusion of what Brent brought, the energy he brought to the band. Phil was playing a new bass, but is it fair to say that I'm surprised because all those guys, everybody has an ego, but all of them were exceptionally brilliant. Some of them were very stubborn. All of them were geniuses. And you're telling me that I understand what you're saying. Well, maybe I don't. The point is that
I'm not saying the band felt that way as much as the fans and the crowd, right, and the people in the industry that wanted things done. Remember, the Grateful Dead broke the rules constantly. For example, after they made Go to Heaven, they didn't make another studio album for 7 years.
Exactly.
While they were a major touring act. Who's ever heard of anything like that? Think about it.
and
they didn't record.
And at the same time, Cutler, which is so classic, is that in that period, their audiences were getting progressively younger, even without any new material.
And bigger.
Yeah,
and much bigger.
Mm-hmm.
They went from doing Winterland to 5,000 seaters to 10,000 seaters to sheds of 20,000 to this and that. And then after In the Dark, which my brother John produced with Jerry, after that, they were in stadiums. This all happened. It was an exhausting, surprising thing. They were never designed to be like a super commercial successful band. They themselves didn't intend it, So when they suddenly had hit records and MTV videos and stuff, it was a whole different thing. But they also had a period of all those years after Go to Heaven and before In the Dark where they got to hone their new sound with Brent, if you follow me, where they got to integrate him into the band so that he became as indigenous as Keith and Donna had been, and where they began to figure out how to use his vocal style.
Right.
And integrate all these new things. And also the improv feel between Jerry and Brent developed at that point, 83, 84, 85, And that was a big part of it, too. So by the time they went into Make In the Dark, they were ready to make a great record because the songs have been road tested for years.
Well, that's true. They were playing a lot of those tunes like 5 years prior, like Throwing Stones and Touch of Grey. Those tunes were in those early. I know they tried to get into the studio in '84, but I want to talk about your brother for a minute. It's fun. I've always been fascinated. These Dick's picks, Dick Latvala, legendary, archivist,
right,
treasure. These Dick's picks were churning out, and I remember, and like I said, Bill, I never saw the band. I only got into the Dead, after Jerry died. I really just, it's a very much a fantasy for me. I mean, the idea that they were still flying commercial in '83 is just legendary to me, and they were playing universities and things like that. But I see this Dick's Picks release 10/14/83 Hartford, and it was John Cutler. I mean, there was some kind of thing where it was his first show that he ran the board for, or something along those lines. And
well,
I mean, can you break that down? Because was he running?
Well, here's the thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Here's the thing. My brother started working for the Grateful Dead sort of as an ad hoc guy in the early 70s. I mean, doing things like repairing amps, and he did one thing or another for them, and then he worked at Alembic where they built the beautiful guitars, custom guitars, and then he wound up working at Hard Truckers Speakers, so they were developing new technology for speakers, which later led to things like Myers Sound and all that. But when they needed someone to go to Egypt, they asked my brother to be the advance man, and that was when he became an employee of the Grateful Dead, not an independent contractor. So from 77, 78 on, right in there, he was doing that. But even before that, they had been hiring him to do things like when they would play Winterland for a 4 or 5 night run for New Year's Eve, they would do a house mix, and that was being done by Dan Healy, who was the front of house mixer. And they would have Harry Popick doing the board up on stage for the monitors. And for the radio broadcast, John would make them a separate mix with a separate splitter snake, if you're following.
Wow, I love this. This is awesome. Yeah.
And he would do it, and that would be the radio mix that would go out for the local radio broadcast, like on PBS, or for the television feed if it got to the point where they were doing a television feed of the show. And so John learned early on how to mix the band. So after a while, he would be the one that would do all of the radio mixes and things, and Healy did all of the house stuff. But then he also started working in the studio, and then Jerry started having him as the front of house guy for the Jerry Garcia band. Not the Dead, but the Jerry Garcia band whenever they would play. And they got bigger and bigger. And then when Dan Healy retired, John took over as the front of house guy for the Grateful Dead. But I think in 83, 84, that era of time, he was still the guy doing the broadcasts, and Dan was still mixing the house. And, of course, in between, there were all kinds of other brilliant engineers involved. Bob Matthews and Betty Cantor Jackson, who, of course, recorded Europe 72, you know what I mean, and things like that. And Stephen Barncard, who was the engineer on American Beauty.
Absolutely.
There were a lot of other people in the orbit who were very talented as well.
You also came across, I guess, switching to this anniversary concert. I haven't really listened to any of the music. I see a lot of pictures from it and things like that. What's your take on this whole, just where they're at, and really, I guess the question would be, would there have been a Grateful Dead without Garcia, and what is left of that legacy in your mind?
Mm-hmm. Well, there certainly wouldn't have been a Grateful Dead without Garcia, because Jerry was a visionary. And whether he wanted to own that or not, he certainly was that. Not that Phil Lesh is not and was not and is not an amazing musician, and not that Bob Weir is not an incredible rhythm guitar player, etc., or Billy Kreutzmann isn't an amazing drummer. All of that is true. Mm-hmm. But the point is that Jerry often had the vision for going from one form of music to another. So he was the guy who taught them the roots of bluegrass, and then from there sort of Americana country and psychedelic, and he was the one that delved into genres, So I think that's fair to say that without Jerry, there never would have been a Grateful Dead. As far as these 50th anniversary shows go, I have so many emotions around something like this, because for me, it's as personal as it is just also being a fan of the band, if you understand what I'm saying.
Sure.
And I look at it and I go, who the real star of this 50th anniversary concert is? It's the Deadheads. It's the audience that has loved this band for so long that they finally become a treasured part of American culture in a way that nobody ever would have thought possible 30 years ago, you know? And I think that the concerts are fine. I'm not one of these people who has a negative attitude about Trey Anastasio playing with the band. He's a wonderful musician and all. But it's very difficult for me personally to listen to the vocal sound of the Grateful Dead without a Jerry Garcia voice in there. Because besides Jerry's playing, his voice was so expressive. It wasn't like he had a great singing voice. Of course, that wasn't what he had, any more than Bob Dylan has a great singing voice. But just imagine Mr. Tambourine Man or Masters of War without the Dylan sneer on it, you know? And it wouldn't be what it is. And for me, there's so many of the songs where it's hard for me to listen to anyone but Jerry sing them because he and Hunter wrote those songs, and they have a certain characteristic and a certain deepness to the lyric that it's very hard for anyone else to bring across, which is not a knock on any of the other guys. I mean, Bruce Hornsby has a beautiful voice, and et cetera. But it's just difficult for me. So for me personally, it's not my favorite thing. I sort of said goodbye to the Grateful Dead in 1995. But I still get a tremendous kick out of the fact that this music that some of us grew up on has become this gigantically accepted thing. You know, America, when there's dangerous art in America, there's sort of 4 stages. You know how they talk about the 4 stages of grief?
Sure.
Well, there's the 4 stages of dangerous art. When it first comes out, everybody is horrified who rejects it. You know, who are these guys, spreading acid and hanging out with the Hells Angels, right? That's the first route. Then, when it becomes popular against all odds, which is what the Grateful Dead did, right? Without hit singles, without the stuff you're supposed to do, not looking as cute as the Beatles and all that. When it becomes popular, then it's grudgingly accepted. Okay, that's stage 2. Stage 3 is it becomes adopted by people, and it becomes like super important, and it becomes an essential part of their lifestyle. And then the 4th stage is 50 years later, it's American history, and they're getting a telegram from Barack Obama congratulating him on their 50th anniversary. A band of outlaws from the acid test. You know?
Right.
And that's the beautiful thing about this country is we can grow and we can learn to accept things that we didn't know we loved. You know? So that's my take on the 50th anniversary. It's America finally realizing how important this is to the culture. And it's exciting because the idea that young people have the attention span to listen to sophisticated jamming and improv that we normally associated with jazz, not rock, it's finally reached acceptance on that level for multi-generationals. And I think that's a good thing for music, you know?
Bill, I mean, this is phenomenal. We got about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to, for not someone who was born in 78, I missed the boat. I don't think I would have wanted to see the band in the 90s just because of Jerry's health. Of course, right. His health was not that great in 84 either, but,
right.
And I think you make a great point because, you see these there was a clash at this, R&B soul festival in the Meadowlands recently, and you see this hostility between cops and fans. And, to me, I read a quote somewhere about some police officer in Chicago, and he's like, yeah, man, it's just everybody's kind of happy. Everyone's in a cheerful mood. And so the vibe is good. And I think that you're right. It's on the light is shining on the fans, the multi generations that go way back. But do you think the Dead, a lot of the times, like the Dead were fantastic musicians. I listen to them because of their musical prowess, but I don't think I would have done that if I was part of if I was a Deadhead. I think I would have been tripped out of my mind. And I wonder sometimes if it was ever like they had legions of fans, But did the Deadheads hurt the credibility of the musicianship of the band? Because just not being part of it, I never knew. But part of me says, boy, I don't know if I would have wanted to have been a Deadhead because I just would have been there for the scene.
Well, I think you make a very good point. And I think that, it's so interesting because I came from New York and I grew up with a much more disciplined kind of music surrounding me. Everything from, the kind of songwriting you got from the Brill Building, and the Carole Kings and the Laura Neros and that kind of thing, all the way to the Bob Dylans and the people like that. And then I came out here, and, the attitude was more like, well, we have 4 chords and we're going to jam on them for 30 minutes. So
right.
Who cares what song you wrote? We're going to tell you what the song is by whatever happens.
Sure.
Which was like a collision of non-navigation with tremendous New York discipline. It was very good for me to be opened up that way. But somehow, at some point, the Dead's fans, the Deadheads, became very, very uncritical. And I'm not sure that was good for the band, if you follow me. In other words, it's good for a band to know that they need to be great to be appreciated.
Right.
And what happened was, at some point, and I'm not the first one to say this, going to a Dead show became a destination rather than a concert. And when that happened, when it crossed that line, and, that may have been after Touch of Grey, when you suddenly had a bunch of young people become Deadheads who didn't know anything about the history of the band and just discovered one song and started coming to these big shows the way they would any other band that they suddenly discovered, That may have been the moment, or it may have been sooner than that, but I don't think that the uncritical aspect of the Deadheads was such a healthy thing. It would, it's always good for your audience to be critical at the same time. On the other hand, the lifelong friendships people made, the tremendous connection people felt with the music, and the fact that there was a real philosophy in Hunter's lyrics, and to some degree Barlow's lyrics too, that had life lessons in there that were very good for people to hear, and that actually talked about a moral code. For all the idea that the Grateful Dead were breaking the rules, they were also suggesting an alternative moral code that actually was a way you could live, And their scene got so big that many people adopted that. So it's a very complicated question you bring up,
Mm-hmm. Well, no, go ahead.
I understand both sides of it,
Yeah, there is no writer. I mean, I'm such a, I'm also fascinated. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the 2 drummers, the double drums. Mm-hmm. To me, as I listen, I only really listen to, I think I've been listening to 1983 for the last year straight. And I just listened to the drummers, and I say, boy, that they were the first band to have double drums. Did they predate the Allmans?
Well, it's a hard thing to say. They may have predated the Allmans a little bit, but they both had double drums around the same time. They used the 2 drummers very differently. I mean, always seen Mickey Hart as more of an accent percussionist, and Billy more as a timekeeper. I mean, that's an oversimplification because Billy plays beautiful fills, etc. But I'm just saying in the way that they fit together. And the thing about the Grateful Dead was they were the first band to have a tribal sound on the rhythm section, rather than a 4/4 time or something. Many of the songs are in 4/4, but then there's the 11 and there's other time signatures, and they were very fluid between them in a jazzy way. But the point was that even when they were sitting in a regular 4/4 pocket, they were always experimenting. I mean, Phil Lesh was rarely playing just a root. He was almost always playing almost a full lead guitar sound on bass, but with this tremendous power to drop bombs that would shake the room, and this richness and uniqueness. And the drummers took the same approach. So what you had was everybody soloing at once, but with so much experience between them that they could keep it from being a cacophony. And that's what was different about them. The 2 drummers were a factor in that, but they were not the only factor. Because, I mean, when have you heard another bass player that plays like Phil Lesh?
Well, I mean,
there really is no one else.
Cutler, you're blowing my mind right now because it's just like, I mean, I've been focusing on it. I say, Kreutzmann held it together. It could have been, I don't think there were a lot of drummers that could have held that together because, in a traditional rhythm section, I mean, the great jazzers, they lock the groove and then the bass and then the drummer swings the band. But a lot of times Billy's playing free, Mickey's playing, more tribal. And then Phil is somehow not clashing with Garcia. That to me is like, I don't understand. And to do it on a consistent.
Part of that is that, what looked unsophisticated at times between the band members was often very, very sophisticated. Like if you take a look at the way Weir and Garcia play together on China Cat Sunflower, where nobody's actually playing a chord, but they're playing in and out of each other, and they're playing like a funk band in the holes, in the pockets between the notes. That's a very difficult thing to do. Only the world's greatest musicians can leave the space for each other to not step on each other at the same time, be constantly flowing, not hesitating in any way. That's the secret to what that sound is like, and why it works so well, And I don't know of any other 4 or 5, if you want to include Pigpen and the original, I don't know if any other group of 5 people could have found that. But they found that spot, and it came from their love of so many different kinds of music. There's an aspect of that comes from bluegrass. There's an aspect that comes from jazz, freeform jazz, the Ornette Coleman side of jazz, And there's an aspect of that just comes from understanding rock and roll, and that you don't have to play 6 strings all the time to have a big sound when you're electrified. 4 strings may be enough.
Go ahead.
There's a lot of things that go into that. But really what goes into it is that they were playing 200 and 300 days a year.
Yeah, right.
So if they had classes, they found them and they got rid of them,
Okay. Final question for you, Mr. Cutler, as we wrap up here on Power Talk 1210. How much did the Dead grow improvisationally after they had a chance to consistently see Miles Davis and his band? Because I mean, I want to just preface it by saying I just transcribed something this morning from Bobby McFerrin, who was a nobody in 1971, and he saw Miles literally let the music, as the song goes, let the music play the band. But it was striking. Bobby thought he knew what improv was, and then Miles got up on stage, played a few notes, and got off the stage. It was in his black trumpet, wah-wah pedal. But then he left the stage and let the band play, and he realized let the music dictate where it's going. And I thought to myself, obviously Pigpen, they were a cowboy blues band, and when Bill Graham started to do those multi-genre shows, I know that those guys. I'm just curious as how much they grew improvisationally after they got a chance to be exposed to Miles.
I think they grew a lot improvisationally, but part of what happened was that they learned that the best improv would work on certain songs, and other things should be left alone as statements. So, like a song like, say, "Box of Rain" or "Ripple," they were smart enough to know that those were little tone poems that made sense just the way they were. At the same time, they'd write something like "Truckin'" in a shuffle mode, and they'd realize that could be 20 minutes of brilliance in the way that they would see, Sketches of Spain or some other jazz piece go and go and go. And they began to learn the difference between which songs would work that way and which songs wouldn't. So rather than just jam, which so many jam bands do, they began to decide, without discussing it so much, just organically experimenting, which songs lent themselves to improv. And then they would have signature licks, even within the improv, that were sort of like, okay, now we're going from China Cat Sunflower to I Know You Rider. It's not like we have a signal lick. It's that when we hear Jerry playing in this other mode, we know that he's exhausted those ideas and he's ready to drop some new ideas. Somebody else picks up on it. Someone adds to it. I mean, that's what they learned from listening to those great jazz players. I don't know if it was just Miles. I would say it would be more than that, because they always had insatiable appetite for other music.
Well,
you know?
I mean, I'm just saying, like,
And then
I could see Lesh, Dave Holland. I could see Tony Williams, with Billy and then Mickey. Anyway, I got to get to the guys themselves to actually talk to them directly. But the other thing I wanted, this is like set 3 of New Year's Eve that we just can't stop the jam with Cutler. We're having too much. I'm just having a ball right now. But so when I talked to Barlow, and he said, Bobby was a rhythm player, obviously. But what was amazing to me was that Barlow said that he needed to create a melody, something that was danceable when he was putting lyrics together. So a lot of the melodic structure of songs like Estimated Prophet and Greatest Story Ever Told, those melodies were actually created by Barlow as well. And I'm curious as to the relationship, as best between, if that was the same as Hunter, as far as, because Robert wrote the lyrics, but I mean, when I hear the melodies, like even the Jerry Garcia band melodies, Cats Down Under the Stars, or I'll Take a Melody,
right.
Are those, because it sounded to me really, I mean, Bobby obviously came up with some lyrics, but mostly it was Barlow creating those songs. That's what he told me. And I'm wondering.
Well,
yeah,
that's very interesting. Here, you know that for a long time before Barlow became Bobby's writing partner, Hunter was Bobby's writing partner.
Right.
And what happened was Bobby was very much the kind of guy who wanted to change all the time what he was given. So Hunter wrote such exacting lyrics with such meaning behind them, he was very uncomfortable with anyone changing his lyrics, right? Mm-hmm. So that relationship kind of fell apart at some point in the early 70s. And Barlow, who was already one of Bobby's best friends and tremendously talented, came in and started writing with Bobby. Now, Bobby is just a brilliant rhythm guitar player. And he hears music in what I would call an angular way.
That's how he describes
Jerry
it.
Heard a rootsy. If there was something at the core of Jerry, it was roots. The roots of bluegrass, the roots of rock, the roots of jazz. Bobby was more of he's like a rock skipping over the water. He would merge and mix and look for angular things and try to challenge himself all the time. And he almost never played down in first position on guitar. So, there wasn't a big bed for the voice to lie in, if you understand what I mean by that. When you're writing a melody, a lot of where the melody comes from is if the other notes in the chord are rich enough so that you can move in and out of those notes, and it's the contrast between your vocal line and the chord. Bobby didn't offer that much of that sometimes. I mean, obviously he wrote songs like Looks Like Rain that did have that, but he also wrote a lot of songs that didn't. And I think Barlow had to come up with ways to make a melody work against such a sparse structure, So I think that Barlow probably made a much bigger contribution to those melodies, and this is just me surmising this, than Hunter did with Jerry, because Jerry was the guy who naturally came up with melodies. He had been a bluegrass, banjo, and guitar guy and a folk guy, singing in folk clubs before there ever was a Grateful Dead. And Bobby was younger. Bobby was my age. And, therefore he was 16, 17 years old when he was getting into the Grateful Dead, and he was learning about the culture of music. Jerry was 4 or 5 years older. It was a very important 4 or 5 years at that age, So that's what I think. Now, I only wrote one song with Barlow. I wrote Home to Dixie on the first Kingfish album, which was actually a song that Matthew Kelly and I had written together, And one night backstage at Winterland, Bobby heard it and said, "Hey, I like that song." At the time, it was called Engine 99. That was the first title.
Wow.
And can we throw that on the brand new record I'm going to do with my side band Kingfish? And Matthew and I said, we were just sitting working on it backstage at a Dead show at Winterland. And we said, sure. And I assumed they were going to record the song we had written. But how wrong I was, because what finally came out on that record was the song Home to Dixie, which is a fine song, but it became, instead of, Kelly Cutler, it was Kelly Cutler, Barlow Weir. So Barlow had written some new lyrics, and they'd used maybe a third of Barlow's lyrics and two-thirds of mine, and they changed the title and to Home to Dixie, and they kept my chorus, but they'd added a bridge, and Bobby. So what I understood from that was that there were no rules. It was a free-for-all, and your song became something else. Now, looking back on it all these years later, I am so proud to have that song on the record, but I was so startled when they did do all those changes, because it was a process that was foreign to me, and I wasn't around when it took place. So I wound up as a co-writer on a song where I only co-wrote with one of the four guys on it. So that's all I can tell you about Barlow.
No, no. I mean, but for the most part, Jerry had melodies constantly going on in his head. So it was really more of like Hunter would come to him with lyrics, and Jerry would have those songs, that stuff in his head.
Yes, and when I would play with Jerry, like when he'd come over to my living room to work on a new song with me, just to learn one of my songs, my experience with him would be that he would hear melody right off the bat. Like if I was singing Riding High to him or Delta Nightingale, I don't know if you're familiar with my songs, but anyway, one of those songs. When it came time for him to play a guitar fill, the guitar fill that he would play would be based on the melody of the song. It wouldn't just be whatever came out of somebody,
Mm-hmm.
It would be directly related, showing me that even after only maybe once or twice through, he had completely absorbed the melody and he was already ready to embellish it the way only a great player who totally understands the parameters can, So Jerry understood melody very well,
Right.
And I wouldn't say Bobby doesn't. I would just say that Bobby preferred a more angular guitar style. And I learned a tremendous amount about being a rhythm guitar player from Bobby.
Yeah,
I'm a rhythm guitar player.
Yeah.
And, when he first met me, I was playing a lot of acoustic, but I was switching to electric. And he gave me a bunch of informal electric guitar lessons, just showing me that how many other ways there were to play an E chord. There's 7 other ways you never thought of, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no. Can you talk a little bit about why? I mean, it's kind of self-evident to a degree, but why the members of the Dead specifically, now that Jerry's passed, they become kind of inaccessible. They've been walled off and have a lot of protection. Even guys that, I know that time, things move on and time goes on and, things. But, I mean, there are cats that are lifelong friends from some of these guys. They haven't seen them, connected with them in years. And I just, Jerry wasn't really, I mean, they had plenty of protection for him too. Well, they formed phalanxes to get him through shows and,
Right.
get him to the hotel. I understand all that. But what's really interesting, man.
Well, they did later on. I mean, not in the years that, I mean, I played with Jerry when I would argue he was in his prime, the mid-'70s, And in that era, I mean, as a player, I mean, there were other wonderful periods too, but I'm just saying this is before any health problems. This is before drug addiction, et cetera. And there was no guarding of anything. I mean, if Jerry came down to my place to hang out, he might bring Billy the Kid Candelario, one of his roadies, to carry a small practice amp, and Jerry would carry his guitars, and they'd come up the stairs, and we'd hang out, and we'd, work on music all day. And it was kind of wild because he had no entourage. He needed no entourage. And if we went out for coffee in the neighborhood, you can imagine in San Francisco, you go out to a coffee shop and of course everybody in the place there sees Jerry walk in. He had a way of keeping everybody so calm and comfortable. He was the same way with the homeless guy in the street as he was with the famous guy that he was meeting. You know, he just had a natural comfortableness with people, and that didn't go away even after he had drug problems. But later on, the band and the entourage and the security felt they had to shield him from people, and things were simply out of hand in the late 80s, early 90s, because things had gotten so big, there was just nothing ever would have gotten done without that. But as far as the other guys being walled off, you know, each guy in that band was a very strong personality, and each guy had his own group of musical friends and who were in their crowd. So, you know, Mickey had the Diga Rhythm Band and all of the exotic players that he was interested in. So when they weren't on the road, they would do their own thing. As they got older, no longer lived together on Haight Street, or no longer even lived super close together in Marin County, you know, they began to move in different circles. They spent so much time together that when they were off the road, they really needed some space. Now, I think that evolved into something where they became less accessible. But to the people that they knew from the beginning, they kept quite loyal. And, you know, they often kept people on through all kinds of ups and downs, you know, through health problems and drug problems and things that other bands might have fired crew members for and things. You know, they didn't do it.
Right.
They believed in family in that sense. And yet there were very different circles in the Dead, and there were very different groups of people surrounding them. And just like anybody that gets successful, there's somebody whispering in your ear that you don't need the other guy. I mean, that's just the music business. It's not about the Grateful Dead. It's just the realities of the music business. Anyone who's had a record deal and a manager, you know, a booking agent, and been on tour knows that kind of situation. You know, there was plenty of that going around, you know, and there was a lot of pressure to keep the Grateful Dead together as a giant money-making operation. So there were competing influences. I was never close friends now with Mickey and people like that. I mean, I was close friends with Jerry, and I knew Bobby quite well up until a certain point, and you know, Billy and stuff, but and Keith and Donna, and later you know, Brent and I played together once or twice, but I wasn't close with Mickey. I never really knew Pigpen.
Right.
So there were different people in the scene. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, it's
just
great.
Because you were hanging out didn't mean you knew everybody. You know?
Well, I was just going to say also, for the record, some of my interviews have shown that Mickey Hart really was not really a drummer that could hold it down. He had a hard time with that, and so he became, I guess, what you would say, a percussionist. You know, he could not. Go ahead.
Right.
You know, I mean, I've heard that from New Riders albums. It didn't work out. They had to bring in Spencer Dryden, and I just feel like, you know, without knowing him, hearing stories. There's a YouTube video of him throwing drumsticks at Matthew Kelly on stage in '85. You know, it's just like. But
well, sure, and when my brother produced In the Dark, he had the challenge of how to record the two drummers. By that time, in 1987, people expected beautiful quality drumming and recording quality of the drumming on records. By then, records had gotten very much more sophisticated than when they had done, like, Go to Heaven. And it was no longer okay to have, you know, two kick drums hitting slightly off each other, both recorded on gorgeous microphones, both in your face, and neither one actually defining where the downbeat was, if you understand what I'm saying.
I do.
So he tried very hard to separate those two things and use Billy on the basics as the timekeeper and get Mickey to overdub many of his fantastic rolls and sounds over the record. And finally recording had gotten to the point where they could use slave reels, where they could, do 2-track mixes and give them to Mickey and let Mickey experiment over them. And that approach, I thought, worked really well. Because, Billy was more of a traditional drummer, and Mickey was more of a wild, experimental, tribal drummer. And I'm not putting a value judgment on that as much as just stating a fact.
Sure.
They were completely different kinds. It wasn't like they had two guys who, like when you see Ringo Starr and Jim Keltner playing together, they both feel the same general pulse to the music, and they may do something differently, but nothing sticks out.
Right,
With
right.
Billy and Mickey, it's the same thing as what I said about the way that Bobby and Phil and Jerry fit together. I mean, they play in the halls between each other. It's a very sophisticated thing. It's very hard to capture when you have 42 mics of drums. There's all kinds of phasing problems, etc. So it's a complicated thing. I think that it was most successful when they would record separately. In the live arena, it worked beautifully because it was tribal, the room shook. The live experience is one thing. You're there for the moment. A record is forever. If there's a glitch on it, you'll be hearing that glitch for the rest of your life.
Yeah. No,
so that was the difference, in my opinion, between the way Mickey and Billy played. Billy was playing a groove, so you could judge a take very easily. Mickey was adding all kinds of wild bursts of energy on top of that. And that, by definition, some of it would be better than other things, right? Therefore, you'd have to cull the best stuff. And you could do that mostly if he was in the overdub phase. So in the studio, it was a challenge. Outside, not so much.
Can you talk a little bit about what you're working on right now?
Well, actually, I'm doing a couple of things. I'm in pre-production for a new album that I'm producing for a guy named George Cole, who is a East Bay songwriter, guitar player, and very talented guy. He's actually the guitar player in the David Grisman Quintet when they're on the road. He plays with Grisman in the acoustic band, but he also has a long background as an electric guitar player, and he's written a bunch of great songs that I think they're very interesting. They have some Django Reinhardt influence, they have some Gershwin influence, and they have some rock influence, and we're putting together an album of his stuff. So that's one thing. I'm also writing a bunch of songs for myself for a follow-up album to my last album, Crossing the Line, which came out in 2008, whatever. I'm thinking about taking my latest batch of songs and doing another album of my own, although nobody seems to really know how anyone can make much money off of recorded music these days, you know?
Right.
It's very much a live business. And, all of us are suffering with Spotify and streaming royalties being so low and things. It's not all a bad thing for exposing music, but it's very hard to get paid. So I'm considering another album of my own. And I spent the last year before that working with a young band in L.A. called the Nasty Souls, who have they're like in their 20s, and they're sort of I don't know, they sound a bit like the Faces and the late 60s, early 70s Rolling Stones, and that's kind of the influence in their music, So a variety of things is what I'm working on.
Well, Cutler, I want to tell you, man, I'm just so pumped to be able to stretch out with you like this. This was a jam, and I really, you're so glib, and I appreciate your, just taking the time today on this Independence Day to break it down.
Sure, man. It's been a pleasure. I love talking to you.
All right, man. And we'll be in touch. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
Peace. We'll be right
Bye-bye.
back on the Jake Feinberg Show.